The sun rose over the Dehradun Valley on October 31st, 1814, illuminating a rugged, dusty ridge that would soon become a graveyard for British arrogance. Perched atop the summit of Nalapani sat the fortress of Kalunga, a modest, hastily constructed stockade of stone and timber that seemed insignificant against the might of the British East India Company. Below, Major General Sir Robert Rollo Gillespie assembled his forces. These were not raw recruits, they were seasoned veterans, dragoons and native sepoys who had swept across the plains of India, dismantling empires and crushing rebellions. To them, the upcoming assault was a formality, a punitive exercise against a mountain tribe that had dared to encroach on company interests. They expected the barbarians within the walls to flee at the first roar of British artillery. But the silence from the fort was not one of fear. Inside, Balbhadra Kumwar commanded a force that defied military logic. He had only 600 souls under his protection, a number that included not just soldiers, but women and children. They were Gurkhas, a people forged in the harsh, vertical landscapes of the Himalayas. They possessed no heavy cavalry, no modern siege guns, and no way to escape. What they did have was an absolute, terrifying refusal to yield. As the British cannons opened fire, tearing chunks of masonry from the walls, the defenders did not cower. Instead, a strange and unsettling sound drifted down the ridge, the sound of laughter and the sharpening of steel. Gillespie, frustrated by the lack of surrender, ordered the assault. The British columns surged forward, their red coats vivid against the brown earth, bayonets gleaming. They expected to storm the breach and end the affair before noon. But as they neared the walls, the hill erupted. A hail of musket fire, arrows and jagged stones rained down upon them. When the British infantry reached the stockade, they found themselves looking up into the faces of warriors who fought with a ferocity they had never encountered. The Gurkhas did not fight like the drilled armies of Europe. They were fluid, aggressive, and shockingly lethal in close quarters. It was here that the British soldiers first felt the bite of the kukri. This curved, heavy blade, weighted forward like an axe, but sharp as a razor, severed muskets and limbs with equal ease. The British watched in horror as their disciplined lines crumbled in the chaos of the breach. Even the Gurkha women joined the fray, hurling rocks and brazenly throwing British cannonballs back at the attackers before they could explode. General Gillespie, a man famous for his bravery and reckless aggression, watched his offensive stall. Enraged, he personally led a reserve column toward the gate, waving his sword to rally his wavering men. It was his final act. A Gurkha marksman fired a single shot that pierced the general's heart, dropping him instantly. The shockwave of his death rippled through the British ranks. The invincible company army had been halted by a handful of mountain warriors. The Battle of Kalunga dragged on for a month. The British eventually cut off the water supply, forcing the garrison to evacuate, but it was a hollow victory. Of the 600 defenders, 520 lay dead or wounded. Balbhadra Kumwar and the surviving 70 warriors simply drew their kukris and cut their way through the British siege lines, vanishing into the hills. Standing amidst the ruins of the fort, the British officers were left with a profound sense of awe. They had come to conquer a nuisance, but they had discovered a martial spirit that mirrored their own. They saw in the Gurkhas a quality that transcended race or politics, an unbreakable will. It was a revelation that would change the course of imperial history. The British commanders realized that such men were too dangerous to have as enemies, but they would be invaluable as friends. On that blood-soaked ridge, amidst the smoke and the ruin, the seed of a legendary partnership was sown. The British Empire did not want to fight the Gurkhas ever again. They wanted the Gurkhas to fight for them. The formalities of peace were concluded in 1816 with the Treaty of Sugauli, a document that reshaped the map of the Himalayas. But hidden within the dry ink of diplomatic borders and trade concessions was a clause that would alter the destiny of the British army. The British East India Company secured the right to recruit from the very tribes that had humiliated them at Kalunga. It was a pragmatic decision born of military necessity, yet it birthed a brotherhood that would survive the collapse of the empire itself. The task of turning these former enemies into British soldiers fell to men like Frederick Young. Young was a British officer who understood that the Gurkha warrior could not be broken into obedience. He had to be led through respect. During the war, Young had found himself isolated during a chaotic skirmish, his own irregular troops fleeing into the tree line as the enemy advanced. Instead of running, Young sat down on a log, resigned to his fate, but refusing to show fear. The Gurkhas surrounded him, intrigued by this solitary figure who awaited death with such calm. They asked him why he did not run. Young replied simply, "I have not come so far to run away." The Gurkhas, recognizing a kindred spirit, spared him. Now, as the commander of the newly formed Sirmaur Battalion, Young leveraged that mutual respect to build the first regiments of what would become the Brigade of Gurkhas. Recruitment became a legendary ordeal, a tradition that turned the simple act of enlistment into a mythical quest. The British sent Gallawallas, recruiters, often serving soldiers, deep into the treacherous foothills of Nepal. They trekked for weeks through blinding snow and thin air to reach the isolated hill villages of the Magar and Gurung tribes. They were looking for a specific type of man, the hillman. The British officers, accustomed to the tall, imposing stature of the grenadiers or the heavy dragoons, were initially baffled by the recruits who descended from the mountains. These men were short, often standing barely 5 feet tall. They did not look like the soldiers in the manual, but their physiology was deceptive. Their legs were thick with muscle, developed from years of carrying heavy loads up vertical slopes. Their chests were deep, adapted to breathe air so thin it would leave a lowlander gasping. They possessed a terrifying stamina and a cheerful resilience that seemed impervious to cold, hunger, or fatigue. This was the birth of Johnny Gurkha, a moniker that blended affection with a hint of patronizing curiosity. In these early years, the regiments were technically local levies, irregular units meant to police the borders. They wore their native clothes before transitioning to early adaptations of British uniforms. However, the cultural synthesis began immediately. The Gurkhas brought with them their own martial religion, treating war not as a tragic duty, but as shikar, a hunt, a sport to be excelled at. Life in these early battalions was a stark contrast to the rigid, flogging-heavy discipline of the regular British line infantry. British officers quickly learned that the brutal corporal punishment used to keep the scum of London's slums in line was unnecessary and indeed insulting to a Gurkha. Their discipline was self-imposed, rooted in an intense fear of shame. To fail one's officer or one's regiment was a fate worse than death. This created a unique atmosphere in the cantonments, a relaxed, almost family-like camaraderie between the British officers and their men off duty, which snapped into lethal, silent efficiency the moment operations began. As the years passed, the local levies evolved into the Nasiri and Sirmaur battalions. They began to drill, mastering the British musket while refusing to abandon their traditional weapon, the kukri. The British military machine, usually so rigid in its desire for uniformity, wisely allowed the Gurkhas to retain their identity. They realized that the kukri was not just a knife, it was an extension of the Gurkha's soul. By the mid-19th century, the experiment was complete. The former enemies were now the company's most reliable shock troops, waiting for a test that would prove their loyalty to a world that still viewed them as mercenaries. That test was approaching, and it would come from within the heart of the British Raj itself. The summer of 1857 descended upon India like a suffocating blanket, bringing with it a storm of blood and betrayal. The Indian Mutiny, or the Sepoy Rebellion, shattered the illusion of British control. Across the subcontinent, regiments of the Bengal native infantry, men the British had trained, armed and trusted, turned their guns on their officers. Delhi fell to the mutineers, becoming the nerve centre of the uprising. The British Empire in India teetered on the brink of annihilation. Amidst this chaos, panic spread through the British command. If the high-caste Brahmins and Rajputs of the Bengal army had revolted, surely the Gurkhas, mercenaries from the north, would follow suit. The Sirmaur battalion, stationed in Dehradun, gave their answer immediately. When the order came to march to Delhi, they did not hesitate. They stripped down to their fighting kits and marched nearly 30 miles a day under the blistering Indian sun to join the British forces besieging the city. But when they arrived at the Delhi Ridge, they were met not with cheers, but with levelled muskets. The British defenders, paranoid and exhausted, saw dark-skinned soldiers approaching and assumed another wave of attackers had arrived. It was only when the British officers recognised the jaunty, pillbox Kilmarnock caps of the Gurkhas that the rifles were lowered. The battalion was assigned to hold a critical position, Hindu Rao's house. This sprawling, whitewashed mansion sat on the spine of the ridge, overlooking the rebel-held city. It was the linchpin of the British right flank. If Hindu Rao's house fell, the ridge would be lost, and the British siege force would be massacred. The mutineers knew this, and for 3 months and 8 days, they turned the mansion into a slaughterhouse. The siege was a nightmare of sensory overload. The heat was relentless, temperatures soaring past 100 degrees, baking the stone walls until they radiated heat like an oven. The air was thick with the stench of rotting corpses, unburied in the no man's land, and the acrid smoke of black powder. Day and night, the mutineers launched waves of infantry assaults, supported by heavy artillery that pulverized the mansion's walls. The Gurkhas, fighting alongside the chaos, found themselves in their element. Unlike the rigid-line infantry tactics of the time, the defense of the ridge required independent initiative. It was a war of snipers, skirmishers, and sudden, brutal counterattacks. Here, the Gurkha reputation for cheerful discipline became legendary. While other units buckled under the psychological strain of constant bombardment, the Gurkhas treated the incoming cannonballs with a dark humour, giving them nicknames and gambling on where they would land. But when the enemy infantry surged up the slopes, the humour vanished. The Gurkhas would wait in silence, holding their fire until the last possible second. Then a volley of musketry would tear through the rebel ranks, followed instantly by the flash of the kukri. In the confined spaces of the mansion's gardens and verandas, the heavy knives were devastating. The mutineers, many of whom were tall, athletic soldiers, found themselves terrified by the short, ferocious hillmen who ducked under their bayonets to strike from below. It was during this crucible that a unique bond was forged. Fighting shoulder to shoulder with the Gurkhas were the men of the 60th Rifles, an elite British regiment dressed in dark green. The two units lived, ate, and died together in the ruins of Hindu Rao's house. The British riflemen, impressed by the Gurkhas' courage, began to call them the Little Men, or the Little Green Men, a term of immense endearment. They shared their rations and their rum, erasing the rigid racial hierarchy of the Victorian army in the face of shared survival. By the time Delhi finally fell in September, the Sirmaur battalion had been decimated. Out of 490 men who had marched to the ridge, 327 were killed or wounded. But they had not taken a single step backward. They had held the house. The aftermath of the mutiny transformed the Gurkhas' identity forever. The British, betrayed by their traditional sepoys, looked at the Gurkhas with new eyes. They were no longer viewed as useful mercenaries. They were saviours. To honour their service at Delhi, the Sirmaur battalion was granted a unique privilege. They were allowed to trade their red coats for the rifle green uniforms of their brothers in arms, the 60th Rifles. They were also granted the Queen's Truncheon, a ceremonial staff of bronze and silver to be carried in place of a standard regimental colour, a singular honour in the British Army. The redcoat era for the Gurkha was over. The era of the elite riflemen had begun. With their new green uniforms and black leather belts, the Gurkhas visually separated themselves from the rest of the British Army. The scarlet tunic was the symbol of the line infantry, the solid wall of men who stood and fired in volleys. But rifle green was the colour of the hunter. It signified a different kind of warfare, one that perfectly matched the Gurkhas' natural instincts: skirmishing, sniping, and the stalk. In the decades following the mutiny, the British Empire expanded its borders into the wild, ungovernable frontiers of the world. Burma, Malaya, and the rugged mountains of the northwest frontier, modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. These were not battlefields suited for the rigid formations of European warfare. The terrain was dense jungle or vertical rock, infested with enemies who fought as guerrillas. This was the Gurkhas' domain. The brand of the Gurkha began to crystallize during these frontier campaigns. They became the masters of stalk and strike. A British column moving through the Khyber Pass was a loud, clanking beast, easily ambushed. To protect it, the Gurkhas were deployed as piquets. Small groups of riflemen would race up the precipitous scree slopes to secure the heights overlooking the road. It was a terrifyingly lonely job. A piquet of 4 or 5 men might be miles from support, surrounded by hostile tribesmen who knew every rock and cave. In these high-altitude duels, the Gurkha developed a reputation for almost supernatural stealth. Stories circulated in the mess halls of British officers about Gurkha sentries who could detect the snap of a twig at 100 yards in a gale. More terrifying were the tales of their offensive patrols. There was a popular, albeit gruesome, myth that a Gurkha could creep into an enemy camp at night, feel the boots of sleeping soldiers to check if they were laced, indicating an enemy ready to fight, or unlaced, and slit the throats of the sentries without waking a soul. The visual terror of the Gurkha was compounded by their silence. While the British soldier might shout orders or cheer, the Gurkha often fought with a grim, quiet focus. When they did make noise, it was the high-pitched, spine-chilling war cry. Ayo Gorkhali! The Gurkhas are upon you! It was a sound that signalled the end of the skirmish and the beginning of the butchery. This era also solidified the Gurkhas' relationship with the kukri. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a multi-tool for survival. In the jungles of Burma, it hacked through vines and bamboo to clear paths. In the camp, it chopped wood and skinned game. But in battle, it remained the ultimate close-quarters terminator. The design of the blade, with its weight distributed towards the tip, allowed a small man to deliver a blow with the momentum of a much larger weapon. A single, well-placed strike could sever an arm or decapitate a foe. The myth that a kukri must draw blood before being sheathed was largely a romantic invention of Victorian storytellers, but the Gurkhas did nothing to dispel it. It added to the psychological armour that protected them as much as their rifle. The British officers who commanded these men became a breed apart. To be a Gurkha officer was the highest ambition for many young subalterns graduating from Sandhurst. It required learning the language, Nepali, and understanding the complex cultural web of the regiment. It wasn't enough to be an aristocrat. One had to earn the respect of the men. The bond was paternal but deeply reciprocal. A British officer was Sahib, a figure of authority, but he was also part of the family. If an officer fell wounded in the open, it was a certainty that his Gurkhas would die, piling their bodies around him, rather than let him be taken. This loyalty was tested continuously on the frontiers of the empire. But as the 19th century drew to a close, the great game with Russia was heating up, and the eyes of the empire turned once again to the graveyard of armies, Afghanistan. The Gurkhas were about to be thrown into one of the most desperate marches in military history, a campaign that would pit the little men against the most feared warriors of Central Asia. It was August 1880, and the Second Anglo-Afghan War was reaching its bloody crescendo. A British garrison was besieged in the city of Kandahar, trapped by an Afghan army led by Ayub Khan. To save them, Lieutenant General Frederick Roberts, known affectionately to his troops as Bobs, assembled a flying column in Kabul. His plan was madness. to march 10,000 men and their animals over 300 miles of blistering desert and jagged mountains, cut off from all supply lines and communication. If they failed, they would die in the wasteland. The 2nd Gurkha Rifles were at the vanguard of this march to fame. For 20 days, the column moved at a punishing pace. The sun beat down with sledgehammer force, the dust choking the lungs of men and mules alike. While the European regiments struggled with the heat and the altitude, the Gurkhas thrived. They marched with a rhythmic, tireless gait, often carrying the rifles of their exhausted British comrades or helping to load the pack animals. Their stamina became the backbone of the entire expedition. On August 31st, the column finally reached Kandahar. Most commanders would have rested their troops after such an ordeal. Roberts attacked the next morning. The key to the Afghan position lay in the fortified village of Pir Paimal. To take it, Roberts unleashed his 2 most aggressive units, the 72nd Highlanders and the 2nd Gurkhas. This pairing was not accidental. A strange and potent rivalry had developed between the Scots and the Nepalese. Both were hill people. Both were fiercely proud of their martial traditions. And both enjoyed the bagpipes, a sound the Gurkhas had adopted with surprising enthusiasm. As they lined up for the assault, the kilted Highlanders and the green-clad Gurkhas looked at each other, not as strangers, but as brothers in a deadly fraternity. The order to advance was given. The Afghan defenders, hardened warriors who had annihilated a British brigade at the Battle of Maiwand just weeks earlier, poured a withering fire into the approaching lines. The air filled with the buzz of Jezail bullets and the roar of artillery. The British line wavered, but did not break. Then, the order changed from advance to charge. What happened next became part of imperial folklore. The 72nd Highlanders lowered their bayonets and surged forward with a roar. Simultaneously, the 2nd Gurkhas did something that terrified those watching. They didn't fix bayonets. Instead, in a fluid, practiced motion, they slung their rifles across their backs, freeing their hands. With their right hands, they drew their kukris. They sprinted into the smoke, small, dark shapes moving with the speed of wolves. The Afghans, accustomed to fighting the static, predictable lines of British infantry, were unprepared for this. The Gurkhas ducked under the swinging tulwars of the Afghans, getting inside their guard. It was a brutal, visceral collision of steel. The thwack of the heavy blades striking home echoed through the village streets. Major General Roberts, watching through his telescope, saw the Highlanders and Gurkhas overrun the position in a tidal wave of aggression. The Afghan resistance didn't just break, it evaporated. The defenders, who feared no man with a gun, found themselves fleeing from the little devils with the knives. After the battle, a captured Afghan veteran of the campaign was interrogated. He sat sullenly, refusing to speak, until he was asked about the soldiers who had defeated him. He looked up, his eyes wide with a lingering horror. "We do not mind the British so much," he reportedly said, "but those little devils who come inside our guard and slice us, they are too much." The victory at Kandahar cemented the Gurkhas' place in the pantheon of the empire's greatest warriors. They had outmarched and outfought the toughest enemy the British had ever faced. But the war was not just about battles, it was about the culture that forged these men. To understand why they fought with such terrifying zeal, one had to understand the life they left behind in the hills of Nepal. The journey of a Gurkha soldier began long before he ever donned a uniform. It started in the remote, cloud-wreathed villages of the Himalayas, places accessible only by narrow footpaths that clung to the sides of precipitous cliffs. Here, the Galawalas, recruiters who were often retired NCOs returning home, would arrive like celebrities. They brought tales of distant lands, strange oceans, and the glory of the Malik, the British government. To the young boys of the Magar and Gurung tribes, enlisting was not just a job. It was the only escape from a life of subsistence farming, a chance to see the world and return as a wealthy man. But the selection process was a brutal Darwinian filter. The British officers, obsessive about maintaining the standard, demanded only the absolute best. The tests were primitive but effective. Young men were loaded with dokos, wicker baskets filled with 70 pounds of rocks, and told to race up steep mountainsides until their lungs burned and their legs screamed. Those who collapsed were sent home. Those who reached the summit without faltering were welcomed into the fold. Once in the regiment, the recruit entered a world that was strikingly different from the rest of the British Army. In a typical British line regiment, discipline was enforced through fear, the lash, the drill sergeant's scream, the rigid hierarchy of class. In a Gurkha battalion, discipline was communal. It was a cheerful discipline. The relationship between the British officer and the Gurkha rifleman was less like master and servant and more like a strict father and his spirited sons. The barracks were filled with laughter. The Gurkhas were inveterate pranksters, known for a dark, self-deprecating humour that baffled outsiders. They gambled incessantly and possessed a childlike curiosity about Western technology. Yet, this playfulness masked a deadly seriousness about their profession. They treated soldiering as a craft. A Gurkha would spend hours honing the edge of his kukri until it could shave the hair off his arm. He would clean his rifle, not because he was ordered to, but because he understood that in the high mountains, a jammed breech meant death. The spiritual heart of the regiment was revealed during the festival of Dashain. This was the most important event in the Gurkha calendar, a celebration of the victory of good over evil, of the goddess Durga over the demon. For the soldiers, it was a consecration of their arms. The regiment would gather, their rifles stacked and garlanded with flowers. The air would be thick with incense and the chanting of the regimental pundits. The climax of the festival was the sacrifice. A young buffalo representing the demon was led into the center of the square. The honor of the sacrifice was given to a single chosen soldier. The pressure on this man was immense. He had to sever the buffalo's head with a single, clean stroke of the kukri. If he succeeded, the regiment would be blessed with good fortune in the coming year's campaigns. If he failed, if the blade stuck or required a second blow, it was a terrible omen, predicting disaster and death for the battalion. British officers would watch this ritual with a mixture of fascination and anxiety, knowing that the morale of their entire unit hung on the strength of one man's arm. When the blade came down, usually with a sickening, wet thud that severed the spine instantly, a roar of relief and triumph would erupt from the watching soldiers. It was a visceral reminder that despite their green uniforms and modern rifles, the Gurkhas remained warriors of an ancient tradition. They were modern soldiers with medieval souls, walking the line between the disciplined structure of the West and the primal, blood-oath loyalty of the East. This unique culture created a soldier who was paradoxically gentle in peace, but terrifying in war. A British general once remarked that the Gurkha was the only soldier who could smile while he kills you. As the 19th century entered its final, turbulent decade, the Gurkhas would need every ounce of that spiritual strength. The northwest frontier was about to explode into a jihad that would test the empire's limits, leading to one of the most famous last stands in history. The year was 1897, and the northwest frontier had ignited. In what would become known as the Tirah campaign, the Afridi tribes rose in a massive, coordinated rebellion, seizing the Khyber Pass and threatening the very stability of British India. The terrain was a nightmare of jagged peaks and narrow defiles, a landscape where a modern army could be swallowed whole. The British response was to send a punishing expedition into the heart of the tribal lands, and leading the way were the Gurkhas. The defining moment of the campaign, and perhaps the ultimate expression of the Victorian Gurkhas' fighting spirit, occurred at the Dargai Heights. The objective was a near-vertical cliff face, atop which thousands of Afridi marksmen were dug in behind natural rock sangars. To reach the enemy, the British forces had to cross an open saddle of ground, a fatal funnel swept by a relentless storm of rifle fire. It was a suicide mission. The initial assaults by British line infantry and other units stalled, the men pinned down by the withering hail of lead. The dead and wounded piled up in the open, the groans of the dying drowned out by the crack of tribal jezails and stolen Martin Henry rifles. The British commanders, desperate and watching the daylight fade, turned to their shock troops, the Gordon Highlanders and the 1st Battalion, 2nd Gurkha Rifles. What followed was a display of the unique brotherhood of the hills. The Gurkhas and the Scots, united by their rivalry and mutual respect, prepared to do the impossible. As the bagpipes of the Highlanders began to skirl, the Gurkhas tightened their belts and checked their kukris. When the order came, they didn't just charge, they scrambled. While the Highlanders provided the mass and the roar, the Gurkhas provided the agility. They moved like mountain goats, finding footholds in the rock that seemed non-existent to other men. They scuttled through the fire zone, low to the ground, using the terrain to shield their small bodies. The Afridis, looking down from their eagles' nests, were unnerved. They could shoot the big men in kilts, but the little devils were closing the distance with terrifying speed, slipping through the barrage like smoke. The assault on Dargai was a bloodbath, but it was successful. The Gurkhas and Highlanders crested the ridge together. The sheer ferocity of their arrival broke the nerve of the defenders. The Afridis, realizing that the men coming up the cliff intended to use cold steel, abandoned their positions and fled into the twilight. The heights were taken. The Gurkhas stood atop the summit, chest heaving, wiping the blood from their blades, masters of the highest battleground on earth. This campaign solidified the Gurkhas' reputation not just as a soldier, but as a saviour of the empire's dignity. They had proven that they could operate in the most hostile environments on the planet, facing an enemy that terrified the regular army, and emerge victorious. They had become the bravest of the brave, a title that was no longer just a compliment, but a recognised military fact. By the dawn of the 20th century, the transformation was complete. The local levies, who had once thrown rocks at General Gillespie's cannons, were now the crown jewels of the Indian army. The image of the Gurkha had been seared into the British consciousness, a small, smiling man with a pillbox hat and a curved knife, standing sentinel over the loneliest outposts of the empire. But the legend of the Gurkha was more than just romantic imperialism. It was built on a foundation of tangible, battlefield utility that no other unit could replicate. They filled a niche that the British soldier, for all his discipline and courage, simply could not. They were the eyes in the dark, the climbers of the unclimbable cliffs, and the shock troops who did not need a bayonet charge to break an enemy line. They needed only to unsheathe their kukris to send a ripple of panic through the opposing ranks. Their legacy is perhaps best summarized, not by a battle honor or a medal, but by the quiet, enduring bond between two island nations, separated by thousands of miles. In the cemeteries of France, Gallipoli, and Burma, Gurkha names are carved alongside those of Smith, Jones, and MacGregor. They did not fight for territory, for they had no claim to the lands they defended. They did not fight for money, for their pay was meagre. They fought for izzat, honor. They fought because they had given their word. As the Victorian era faded and the mechanized horror of the world wars loomed, the Gurkha remained a constant. The ethos forged in the 19th century, the cheerful discipline, the refusal to retreat, the deadly skill with the blade, would carry them through the trenches of the Western Front and the jungles of the Pacific. They would earn Victoria Crosses and global fame, but their core identity would never change. They remained the sons of the mountains. They were the warriors who had once held a fortress against an empire with nothing but stones and courage, and who, when offered a hand in friendship, grasped it with a loyalty that shamed the very people they served. From the blood-soaked ridge of Kalunga to the dizzying heights of Dargai, the Gurkha story is a testament to the power of the human spirit. It is the story of how a small, underestimated people forced the world's greatest superpower to respect them, not by adopting the ways of the conqueror, but by remaining fiercely, unapologetically themselves. As the sun sets on the age of empire, the shadow of the Gurkha remains, long, sharp, and unbreakable. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.